You may be asking, why does it seem like Yeshua, Jesus, was contradicting the law of Moses? After Yeshua quoted something apparently written in the Torah, he would then pivot and say, "But I say unto you." Why did Yeshua say, "But I say unto you"? Was he about to contradict the law of Moses? Many people think so, but I say absolutely not. Yeshua never contradicted the law of Moses. He contradicted the traditional teachings of men by elucidating or illuminating the law in spirit and in truth. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, Yeshua used the phrase, "But I say unto you," 12 times, and 6 of those were found in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. In this presentation, we're going to unpack Yeshua's first use of the phrase, "But I say unto you," and show you that Yeshua was neither contradicting nor was he replacing the law of Moses with his own laws. We're going to show you that Yeshua was actually upholding the law of Moses in spirit and in truth. So the first time Yeshua uses the phrase, "But I say unto you," is found in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 22. But to put this in context, let's read from Matthew 5:21. Yeshua said, "Ye have heard that it has been said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you." So it seems like a contradiction is about to come from Yeshua, right? Okay, hold that thought. Now, one thing we need to understand is that in the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua called out front and center several of the traditional teachings that had been passed down orally from generation to generation. And this saying was one of them. Yeshua did not call out those sayings because he was against the commandments of Elohim or that he was against the law of Moses. He called them out simply because he was against adding teachings to the commandments of Elohim that would practically make those commandments of no effect. It would actually water down the effect that it should have in people's lives. We also need to understand that before Yeshua called out those sayings, he prepared the people for what he was about to teach by saying to them in Matthew 5:17, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Yeshua prepared them because he was about to say some things that could have sounded like an attack against the written law or an attack against the writings of the prophets. Without preparing the hearts and minds of the people, his words could have easily been misunderstood. But those who had been prepared would have been enabled to discern that his words would be actually performing a type of spiritual circumcision by surgically cutting off and throwing away the teachings of men that had wrapped themselves around the commandments of Elohim. And without proper preparation of the heart and mind, it would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to differentiate between the commandments of Elohim and the traditions of men. Without discernment, you'll think it's all the word of God. And that was the main issue Yeshua was addressing in the Sermon on the Mount. When we allow the teachings of Yeshua to cut off and throw away the traditions of men that have been wrapped around the commandments of Elohim in our own lives, then we begin to indeed understand what it means to be circumcised in heart or to have a circumcised heart. Now, after Yeshua had prepared the people, he began to surgically address the things pertaining to the law of Moses that had been wrapped in the traditions of men. He started by addressing the saying that had come down through tradition about the sixth commandment of the Ten Commandments. Listen carefully. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21, Yeshua said, "Ye have heard that it has been said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." So why did Yeshua call out that saying? What's wrong with it? If you remember what is written, you'll hear the sixth commandment plus something else that was said as an addition to it. In addition to the commandment, which is, "Thou shalt not kill," the additional saying was, "And whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." So the reason why Yeshua called out that saying regarding the sixth commandment was because an additional saying had become linked to it. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying, "And whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment"? And I say that's a fair question. But when you hear what Yeshua said about that addition, you'll understand that it was, in fact, a shallow teaching that lacked the spiritual depth and instruction intended by the Most High. What we need to know is that Yeshua was not a teacher of the letter of the law. Yeshua taught the spirit of the law as it descended to mankind from the mouth of the Most High, the Creator, the possessor of heaven and earth. We must remember that the 10 words that were given to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai were first proclaimed to them from the mouth of the Most High before they were etched in tablets of stone. He etched them in stone because the people were not able, or I should say, not willing, to bear a direct relationship with the Most High. Therefore, the word could not be written or inscribed upon the tablets of the hearts of the people as first intended by the Most High. The word had to be transcribed upon tablets of stone. We need to know that the 10 words are directly from the mouth of Jehovah Elohim, who is a spirit. So therefore, the commandments of Elohim are spiritual in nature. The Apostle Paul said in his epistle to the Romans, chapter 7, verse 12, "Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good." And Paul goes on to say in verse 14 of the same chapter, "For we know that the law is spiritual." Yes, the law is spiritual. So any teaching of or about the law that does not bring forth the spiritual qualities of the law is shallow in nature, and it results in people's understanding being darkened and their lives falling short of what the Most High had in mind from the beginning. As it is written in the Psalms, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." Okay, so now let's begin to unpack what Yeshua went on to say about what was added to the sixth commandment. In Matthew 5:22, Yeshua said, "But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment." Now notice, the tradition said, "Whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." But Yeshua says, no, whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. In other words, the religious tradition that was handed down to them only judged the offender after the act of unjustly taking the life of another person had been committed. But the Most High, who is spirit and who is the Father of spirits, begins to judge the spirit of a man when an evil thought is conceived in his heart before the physical deed is done. So, to illustrate the point of judging a man when an evil thought is conceived in his heart, we read in the book of Genesis about two sons of Adam and Eve. The oldest son's name was Cain, and the youngest son's name was Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 7, we read, "In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." There we can see that the Most High confronted Cain about the intense anger that was in his heart because his brother and his brother's offering were valued by the Most High, while he himself and his own offering were not valued by the Most High. When Cain became angry, the Most High said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen?" In other words, the Most High was asking Cain, is there a just cause for your anger? The Most High then advised Cain on how to overcome his intense anger. He instructed Cain that if he were to do good, then he would be accepted. Then the Most High warned Cain by saying, if you do not do good, then sin is crouching at the door. The word picture is that sin, as a crouching lion that waits at the door of Cain's heart, is there seeking for an opportunity to devour Cain as its prey. And then the Most High went on to say to Cain, sin's desire is for you. Meaning, sin's desire is not just for Cain to destroy his brother's life. Sin also wanted to devour Cain's life. Then the Most High gave a mandate to Cain, saying, but you must rule over it. In other words, overcome the sin within you by doing good. As it is written in Romans 12:21, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. But instead of Cain taking heed to the counsel of the Almighty, Cain chose to allow his intense anger to consume him, and he turned against his brother and took his brother's life. Genesis chapter 4 and verse number 8 says, and Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. Why did Cain slay his brother Abel? 1 John chapter 3 and verse number 12 tells us that Cain was of the wicked one, and he slew his brother. And wherefore did he slay him? Because his own works were evil and his brother's works were righteous. The point being made here is that the Most High shows us in the case of Cain and Abel exactly when and where judgment should begin. It should begin when unjustified anger is manifested in a person. And the place of judgment should be at the address or the target of the heart. At that point in time, the judgment seeks to address the issues of the heart before those issues escalate to worse things and ultimately taking someone's life as well as destroying his own life. The New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse number 12, tells us that the word of Elohim is a discerner of thoughts and the intentions of the heart. So again, Yeshua said, "But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment." Can you see that Yeshua was directing the attention to matters of the heart as the true target of judgment? Can you also see that Yeshua was teaching preventative judgment as the first step so that punitive judgment or punishments would not be necessary? So from Yeshua's teaching, we begin to learn that the law is primarily spirit. We learn that the spirit of the law is primarily preventative in its purpose. This means it is intended to prevent the actions that it forbids. Early intervention can result in reconciliation and prevention of worse things happening. We also learn that secondarily, the law is punitive. This means the law requires that a just or fair recompense be paid by the guilty person for the offense or the transgression committed against the other person. Now, Yeshua's teaching, based on the spirit of the law, informs us that the law is the means by which we first judge our own thoughts and the motivations of our own hearts as an opportunity to identify and turn from evil. As it is written in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 31, "For if we judge ourselves, we should not be judged." Now let's take a closer look at what Yeshua said in Matthew 5:22, and let's clarify the meaning of some words that have been lost in most English translations. So again, in Matthew 5:22, Yeshua said, "But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment." So a simple reading of that verse in the King James Version of the Bible seems to be saying that anyone who harbors unjustified anger towards another person is in danger of the judgment, right? Well, almost. There's a deeper meaning that has been lost in translation. Now, there are two words in that verse where the depth of meaning is lost in the translation from Greek to English. The first word is the word angry, and the second word where the depth of meaning is lost is the word danger. When you understand them, it will help make the meaning of the verse pop or stand out. So let's look at the word angry. Yeshua said, "Whosoever is angry with his brother." What is the underlying Greek word that was translated in English as angry? And what does it mean? Now, if you go to a Greek lexicon, you'll see the Greek word behind angry is orgizo, which simply means to be angry. But in this case, the Greek word orgizo is not the actual word used in the Greek text of the Bible. The actual word used in the Greek text is orgizomenos. So now the question is, what does the Greek word orgizomenos mean? Since that is the actual word used in the Greek text. Okay, orgizomenos means to be full of anger, or to be acting furiously, or to be outraged. This Greek meaning aligns with the Hebrew word hamit aber, which speaks of the act of a person crossing a boundary or acting with unwarranted rage. Now, if we read the meaning of the Greek word orgizomenos back into Matthew 5:22, it would sound something like this. And whosoever is full of anger or is outraged or furious at his brother. So, can you see how that begins to enhance the meaning of what Yeshua is actually saying? He's not talking about being angry in a general sense of the word. He's talking about someone being outraged. Remember, Cain was very wrong or intensely angry at his brother Abel. And not only was Cain intensely angry, his feelings were unjustified. Being angry in a general sense is not a sin as long as a person doesn't cross the line and become outraged without just cause. As it is written in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse number 26, be angry and sin not, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. In other words, if someone provokes you to anger, be careful not to allow your anger to drive you to commit a sin. But if your anger prompts you towards wrathful behavior, do not let the sun go down before you deal with it by going to the person who offended you and letting that person know of the offense in hope of reconciliation, hope that it gets resolved. Now let's look at the second word, danger. So in the Greek lexicon, the Greek word behind danger is enokos, which means to be subject to or to be liable to. In this context of Matthew 5:22, enokos is a legal term that pertains to being guilty of having done something wrong, having done wrong. In other words, the moment someone crosses a line where their anger turns into outrage or wrath or fury towards his brother without a just cause, that person is liable or guilty of the offense of transgression and is therefore subject to being judged by a court. Now, we need to understand that the judgment Yeshua mentioned in this statement is not the final judgment before Elohim at the great white throne. It is a judgment before men, before a court of men. And I'll tell you more about that a little later in this presentation. Now, the point that Yeshua is making here is that the teaching that came down through the generations about the sixth commandment placed the court for unjustly taking the life of another person after the act was committed. That tradition omitted the spirit of the Torah that commanded us, according to Leviticus 19 and verses 17 through 18, where it says, thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor and not suffer sin upon him. Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. So the tradition omitted that element, that spirit of the law that is captured there in Leviticus. So if you love your neighbor as yourself, it means something. It should mean something in practical terms, not just something that you say off the top of your head. So to love your neighbor as yourself means that you do not allow hatred in your heart against your brother. And if your brother commits an act that provokes you to anger, go to that person in love and rebuke him so that his sin won't remain upon him. If he repents, obviously, if he repents, then his sin will not remain upon him. And loving your neighbor as yourself does not hold a grudge or seek to take revenge against any of your people. It seeks peace and reconciliation. So Yeshua is showing us that the true spiritual teachings of the Torah are superior to the oral tradition that had been handed down through the generations. The tradition that came down about the sixth commandment taught nothing about the inward passions and motives of the heart, where the physical act of unjustly taking someone else's life actually begins. This shortcoming of that tradition was that it could easily result in a person presuming that they were righteous while inwardly full of rage, as long as they didn't physically take someone's life. So being righteous in the sight of Elohim is not achieved by adherence to the letter of the law. It is achieved as we are led by the Spirit of God within us, as it is written in Romans chapter 8 and verse number 4, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. And again, we are taught in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse number 6 that we are ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And again, Yeshua said in John 6 and 63, the words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. Now, there are many places in the Gospels where Yeshua reproved those who were outwardly appearing to be righteous, but inwardly they were full of evil and deceit. Now, I had mentioned earlier that I would say something about the court system that existed during the time of Yeshua's ministry, during this second temple time frame. So there were courts in those days that adjudicated matters of the law. Now, here's a little bit of historical background. First of all, in the law of Moses, it is written in Deuteronomy 16 and 18, judges and officers thou shalt make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the peoples with just judgment. So there we have the Torah instruction for the people to choose and put in place judges who were to administer justice. They were also instructed to set in place officers who were to perform administrative operations of the legal system and to enforce judicial rulings and to enforce compliance to the law within their cities. Now, according to a book called the Mishnah and another book called the Tosefta, which were both 2nd century AD written compilations by the Pharisees of the oral law or the oral tradition, We learn from those books that there was a court system that had 3 tiers or 3 levels that had been established for judging matters of the law. The first tier or first level of their court system mentioned in the Mishnah and the Tosefta was called in the Hebrew tongue Beit Din, which translates into English as a house court. The Beit Din or house court consisted of 3 judges. The second tier court in their system was called in Hebrew Beit Din Shel Eshrim Vashelosha, which translates into English as a house court of 23. That court consisted of 23 judges, and the third tier of their court system was called in the Hebrew tongue Sanhedrin Gedolah, which translates into English as the Great or the Grand Sanhedrin, which consisted of 71 judges. Now, the lower court, or the Beit Din, also known as the Court of 3, was responsible for adjudicating issues like monetary cases, theft, damages, loans, conversions, and certain ritual matters. But the Court of 3 did not judge on matters pertaining to capital punishment. So since unjustly taking someone's life is a capital offense that could result in death or a death sentence, such cases were adjudicated by the higher or the next higher court, the Beit Din Shel Eshrim Veshlosha, which was the court of 23. Now, the second tier court of 23 was responsible for adjudicating capital cases, tribal matters, false prophets, and a city that had been led astray. And the third tier court, known as the Grand Sanhedrin or the Great Sanhedrin, they adjudicated cases of national security, trials of kings, trials of high priests, expansion of the temple or city boundaries, war decisions, and appointments of lower courts. Now, when we look at the judicial responsibilities of that 3-tiered court system, we see that the second tier court of 23 was responsible for hearing cases that involved someone taking the life of another person. So you might ask, where are you going with this? What does this have to do with what Yeshua said in Matthew 5:22? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. This has a lot to do with what Yeshua said about being liable to judgment. As a matter of fact, you really can't fully understand the teaching of Yeshua on this matter without first understanding the background information on how their courts were structured. It establishes a context for Yeshua's legal prescription. Yeshua's method of preventative justice or preventative judgment in a way parallels the 3-tiered court system of that day. But since Yeshua was establishing a uniquely different community called the ecclesia in the Greek, called the kahal in the Hebrew, and called the assembly or the congregation or the church in English, his judicial system would not be based upon conformance to the religious customs and the traditions of that day that did not align with the true teachings of the kingdom of heaven. And as the chief ambassador of the kingdom of heaven, Yeshua came to establish and grow a global congregation of people, a global kahal, a global ecclesia of people consisting not only of Jews, but both Jews and Gentiles. As a matter of fact, people from every nation, kindred, and tongue. So what we're seeing in Yeshua's teaching here in Matthew 5 is foundational for understanding how righteous judgment should be implemented in the global congregation of Yeshua. We must endeavor to establish righteous judgment in our local, regional, national, and global congregations that's based upon preventative judgment, where punitive judgment is implemented as a means of last resort. Now back to Matthew 5:22. The problem Yeshua was addressing was not about the structure of the traditional court system of that day. He was addressing the fact that the tradition only adjudicated the unlawful death of someone on the second tier court of 23, and that judgment happened after the crime had been physically committed, and that their system of judgment began on the punitive side of things. There was nothing in place that may have prevented the escalation of an offense to a murderous outcome. Remember, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Their system of judgment was activated on the punitive side, whereas the true spirit of the law, as Yeshua taught, is activated on the preventative side, on the life-preserving side. Now, this is not to say that the sinful act should not be judged on the punitive side. It is to say that punitive judgment should be a last resort. Yeshua is arguing that the judgment for violating the sixth commandment should not begin with the higher court of 23 after the tragedy has happened. It should begin on the lower level, similar to a court of 3. Judgment involving a lower court should begin at the time before the outrage escalates to someone taking another person's life. Now let's look again at what Yeshua said in Matthew 5:22, where he said, "But I say unto you that whosoever is outraged with his brother without a cause shall be liable to the judgment in a court." Yeshua is saying that the time to get other members of the community involved in judgment is when someone expresses unjustified outrage against his brother. Now, having said that, if you know that someone is holding something against you, Yeshua instructs you to go to that person first. In Matthew 5:23 and 24, he says, "Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift." Now, since the Most High prefers obedience over sacrifice, taking steps towards being reconciled with a person holding something against you must be given a higher priority than you giving an offering of worship to God. When you know that someone is holding something against you, whether their claim is true or whether their claim is false, make going to that person with the intention of being reconciled to that person a higher priority than you giving anything as an offering to God. If disputes are settled on this level, there will not be a need to take matters to court, not even to a court of 3. So, what are some of the signs we need to be aware of that, if unchecked, could escalate to becoming a real threat? Well, we've already covered one, quoting from Yeshua, "Whosoever is outraged at his brother without just cause." We saw that in the example of Cain. Another thing Yeshua said in Matthew 5:22 is, "And whosoever shall say to his brother, Reka, shall be in danger of the council." Now, Reka, what is Reka? What does Reka mean? The word Reka is believed to have been used as an Aramaic insult. Reka is not an English translation of a Greek word. It is not even a Greek word. Reka is a transliteration of an Aramaic word. To transliterate means to say the word as it is said and as it sounds in the original language without translating it or matching it with an equivalent word in the host language. So, what does Reka mean in Aramaic? In Aramaic, Reka means empty-headed, good for nothing, or brainless one. The insult suggests that someone is mentally empty, foolish, socially insignificant, or not worth listening to. When I was growing up, I heard people use the insulting phrase, "you big dummy." There was a certain character on television who used that phrase a lot, "you big dummy." But I understand that this is very close to the tone of what Reka means in Aramaic. So, according to Yeshua's teachings, when someone calls another person Reka or something close in tone to Reka, like "you big dummy," that person is liable to the judgment by a council or a second-tier court. Why? Because contemptuous speech directed at another person not only humiliates that person on a personal level, it also affects that person or impacts that person publicly when those words are said publicly. And it can result in a loss of social status, in social isolation. It can result in a person's reputation being destroyed, a loss of employment, a loss of income. It is a serious matter when someone escalates their feelings of contempt to that level. So, in the context of Yeshua's covenant community, the council would be the assembly of qualified elders who would adjudicate those matters outside of the legal court system. And since no one can undo contemptuous words that have been spoken out of the mouth of someone with hatred and rage, the council would serve to repair the damages done to or within the covenant community and also to the injured person's honor. While at the same time, this council would be encouraging repentance and reconciliation. If the offender does not repent by recognizing and acknowledging the dignity of the person he has spoken contemptuously about, that offender's relationship with the covenant community becomes subject to change. In other words, that person can be shunned or avoided according to Scripture, or that person can be ultimately excommunicated from the community. Now, if we go to 2 Thessalonians chapter number 3 and verse number 6, we read, "Now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly." So you see there, it's right there in the scriptures, right? And it goes on to say, they not only walk disorderly, but they also do not walk after the tradition which they have received from us. In other words, the teachings of Yeshua in this regard. So, If you hear someone using contemptuous speech towards his brother or against you, know for certain that that's not a thing to take lightly. As Yeshua said, he who is outraged at his brother without a cause is liable to the first tier judgment. But in the case of contemptuous speech, he is in danger of the second tier judgment of a council. This teaches us that contemptuous speech is one step closer to physically taking someone's life than being outraged without a just cause. As you can see, it escalates. Now, another way you can tell when someone has something against you is based on what Yeshua also said in Matthew 5:22, where he said, "But whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire." Now, the Greek lemma underneath the word fool is moros. It's where we get the English word moron from. The Greek word moros is an adjective that means foolish or stupid or unintelligent. However, the actual Greek word in the Greek manuscript is more, which is a way of addressing someone not only as a fool or stupid or as a dummy. It further goes into it, if we look at it in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Old Testament in the Greek language, we can see a deeper meaning of it when we look at Psalm 14:1. And in Psalm 14:1, it says, "The fool, the more, has said in his heart, there is no God." So the Hebrew thought calling someone a more is calling them godless, morally corrupt, morally bankrupt, and morally disgraceful. So, in other words, the level of insult and contempt for a brother has expressed itself in a way that denounces the moral value or the spiritual value of the brother. It strips the brother of any dignity as a person made in the image of God. When a person says to another person, "you fool," in a sense of calling him or her godless, spiritually inept, morally corrupt, or morally bankrupt, they are indeed liable to the judgment, but not just to any judgment, but a judgment of hellfire. And this judgment is like the third tier level of justice in Messiah's community of justice. Now, notice the three things Yeshua mentioned as making someone liable to the judgment of a court system are indeed escalations of offenses towards devaluing another person's life. Being outraged against someone without a just cause, as it was in the case of Cain, is the beginning of the angry person's devaluation of the other person's life. Whenever something happens on that level, the offender is liable to an ecclesiastical court of three. If the outrage escalates to humiliating name calling like Reka or you big dummy, and the name calling escalates even higher to call someone a fool or being morally or spiritually valueless, then the offender has devalued the other person's life to the point of being worth nothing. And whenever someone reaches this level of contempt, they are truly in danger of the final judgment before the throne of the Almighty Judge of heaven and in earth. And they are liable to be sentenced to punishment in hell fire. Now, to show what this kind of judicial escalation should look like in Yeshua's covenant community, let's look at something he taught that you may have read dozens of times. But without this background, his teaching can be easily misunderstood. So let's look at Matthew chapter 18, beginning at verse number 15, where Yeshua said, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. And if he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother." So what Yeshua is saying in the context of the three-tiered court system and in the context of the oral tradition of those days is that if your brother trespasses or sins against you, your first course of action should not be to take the person to a legal court. Your first action should be to go to that person and tell that person their fault in private. No one else needs to know. In other words, the lower court of three does not even need to know. They do not need to be informed or engaged in this matter. Now, Yeshua went on to say in verse number 16 that if he will not hear you, then take with you one or two more, and at the mouth of two or three witnesses, every word may be established. So if the person who has trespassed against you does not hear you or receive what you're telling him, then take one or two other members of the faith community with you to the person who trespassed against you. Then try to tell him his fault again while the other one or two persons listen to the complaint being told to the offender. So now we're seeing something that resembles the Beit Din, the house court, the court of three. However, Yeshua taught that a court of two or a court of three is significant, and it is sufficient for judging the matter. Yeshua said that in the mouth of two or three witnesses, every word may be established. That means that every word of the witnesses shall stand or shall be legally and spiritually binding in the covenant community of Yeshua. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 5 and 6 speaks to the shame it is when a brother in Messiah Yeshua goes to court outside of the faith community against his brother, and that court hearing is done before unbelievers. It is shameful when there is no one in your faith community who is able to judge between brethren. Now back to Matthew 18. Yeshua said in verse number 17, "And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it to the church, the assembly. But if he neglect to hear the church, the assembly, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and as a publican." This level of hearing by the assembly or qualified elders of the assembly is similar to the court of 23 mentioned earlier, but it's not the court of 23. This court is not the traditional second-tier courts that existed during Second Temple Judaism. This is an ecclesiastical council of elders in the covenant community of Yeshua. So on this level of ecclesiastical council, if an offender does not hear the assembly, then that person is to be rejected by the assembly and considered to be an outsider who is then subject to the judgment of the Almighty Judge. What we need to know, based on the authority of Yeshua's word, is that the kingdom of heaven stands behind and stands with the process of judgment that Yeshua prescribed to his assembly. Yeshua went on to say in Matthew 18:18, "Verily I say unto you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, And whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. In this context, binding and loosing has everything to do with judicial agreements between at least two members of the assembly of Yeshua in the earth. Whatever you judiciously and righteously forbid or restrain in earth shall be forbidden or restrained in heaven. If the judgment is done in righteousness, then heaven stands behind that decision to enforce it on a spiritual level. Yeshua went on to say in Matthew 18 and 19, "Again, I say unto you, that if two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven." Yeshua is saying that even if the agreement is reached on the level of two persons in matters of judgment, heaven stands behind that agreement, and the Father will do on a spiritual level whatever is asked of him in order to enforce that agreement. Another way of saying it is that if two of you shall agree to the same judicial verdict, that a person is either guilty or not guilty, after properly judging a matter according to the spirit of the law, as Yeshua taught, then the sentence to bind, forbid, or restrain the guilty person is upheld by the court of heaven. And if the verdict is not guilty, then the decision to loose or release the person from the charges shall also stand in the court of heaven. Yeshua concluded in Matthew 18 and 20, "For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." In other words, even in the smallest gathering for preventative judgment, Yeshua is in the midst. So, in conclusion, did Yeshua contradict Moses when he said, "But I say unto you"? Absolutely not. He was not contradicting the written Torah. Yeshua was upholding what had been written by stripping away the additional oral tradition that had become linked to the law, that had made the law of no effect. Whosoever has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the redeemed assembly of Yeshua. Thank you for listening, and if this teaching has been beneficial to you, please click on the like it or love it button and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to or follow our channel. Also, please feel free to share this content with others. And if you feel so inclined to do so, please consider financially supporting our work with a one-time or monthly contribution to this ministry by simply using your smart device to scan the QR code shown on the screen. So until next time, Shalom, Shalom Aleichem, B'Shem Yeshua. Perfect peace to you in the name of Yeshua.